Hello and welcome to this initiative brought to you by Border Studies in South Asia. We are a group of researchers and students studying borders and border regions in South Asia. I am your host Uddipta, and for today's episode we have with us Professor Kathleen Staudt, Professor Emerita, University of Texas at El Paso. In today's discussion, we will try to look at some of the changes that have come to influence the understandings concerning borders and boundaries in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. We will also try to look through a comparative perspective the South Asian and US-Mexico borderlands. We will also try to look at the feminist perspective of looking into borders or boundaries. So do watch the video to the end and do subscribe to our channel if you haven't done it already. Before Professor Kathleen joins us in a moment from now, let me give a brief introduction about her to you. She retired as Professor of Political Science and Endowed Professor of Western Hemispheric Trade Policy Studies at the University of Texas at El Paso. She had joined the faculty in 1977. She founded the Center for Civic Engagement in 1998 at UTEP and directed it for 10 years. Her research interests, published in over 100 journal articles and book chapters, include borders, women or gender in international development, immigration, education, activism, and violence. She has authored and edited 20 books, 9 of which focus on the US-Mexico border. Her latest books are Border Politics in a Global Era, Comparative Perspective in 2017. In this book, she also looks at the South Asian borderlands and provides a comparative perspective. Hope for Justice and Power, Broad-Based Organizing in the Texas Industrial Areas Foundation was published in the year 2020. We will provide a link to some of our important works and important books in the description section below. You are free to go and refer to them, and you can also come back if you have any questions and doubt. You can mention them in the comment section and we will definitely convey them to Professor Kathleen. She is currently working with a research team led by Carleton University political scientist Laura McDonald on transnational civil society organizing in North America, funded by the Canadian Social Science and Humanities Research Council. Thank you so much, Professor Kathleen, for joining us today for this interview. It's indeed a great pleasure to be speaking to you. So, Professor Kathleen, you have witnessed the expansion of border studies all over the world. And we can rightly say that you have, in fact, contributed to it in a great sense. But today we see that on the face of this COVID crisis, many of the academicians or practitioners are claiming that, this world is heading towards a mode of restrictive borders or say walls. As border studies scholar, how do you see this present situation impacting the notion of borders or understanding of borders?
Well, in border studies, first of all, let me say I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. In border studies, I think we have always noticed the dynamism of the spaces and fields in border studies. And back in the 1990s, people were referring to bordering, rebordering, debordering, and certainly here at the US-Mexico border, we have seen debordering, the relaxation of borders for trade purposes, but not for the purposes of controlling immigration. And with the pandemic, I think we are seeing rebordering. We are seeing a rise of nationalisms, I should say, because I think all over the world, national governments have taken charge and established various policies related to trying to control the infections and enforce social distancing and face masks and so on. So for example, here at the US-Mexico border, which I hope people realize is a long border, but generally friendly when it comes to the central governments of both countries. It's a 2,000-mile border. There are differences between the western, the central, and the eastern borderlands. I'm in the central borderlands, but the entire border was closed in March except to people who were considered essential. And I'm putting that in quotation marks. That is to say, travel for citizens, US citizens, was permitted back and forth across the border. Travel for permanent legal residents, people who are about to get naturalized as US citizens. But the frequent interaction at the border of people with the what are called here laser visas that are established under certain visa requirements for simple interaction to go shopping or visit relatives for very temporary visits, that was closed down. And so it was closed until June 22nd. But just the other day, we have learned that all three governments that are part of North America, that is the US, Mexico, and Canada, have closed the border until July 21st. Now, what does this mean for trade? The interests of the global corporations that are involved in trading relationships have been a powerful force before the pandemic and even now. Why is that? There are supply chains, as they call them, of manufacturing that is partially done in Mexico, where the cost of labor is very low, to the US, and sometimes back and forth. And so when it comes to the pandemic, many of those factories, which are called maquiladoras, have been considered to be or have been promoted as essential in order to keep the trade flows going. But in so doing, the workers in those factories, there are over 300 of them in our neighbor city, Ciudad Juarez, and approximately 325,000 workers. In those factories, there were very flimsy efforts to protect workers. Little bits of plastic separating them. When it was decided to take temperatures to see if they might be carrying the virus, the people were lined up close to each other. And we know these things from pictures that workers took of the lines inside the factories. Nevertheless, some of them were closed. So there's this nationalism when it comes to border security as protecting health security, but there is also the prevailing, dare we call this, the global neoliberal economic forces that seek to retain the trade flows. So then on the one hand, there is nationalism. A second feature that relates to borders is how the US president and several other populist presidents, I don't know if you use the word populism in Asia and South Asia, but in the Americas, it's often referred to as people who appeal to popular forces, sometimes with rhetoric, hateful rhetoric, promises, etc. And of course, in the United States, we have a right-wing populist, and he has always criticized Mexico and Mexicans, while hopefully realizing that our countries are interdependent, especially with respect to trade. But there's been a rise even in demagoguery. And especially when our president, President Trump, I think many people would agree, botched the relationship of U.S. to states when it came to trying to control the pandemic. There weren't enough preventive materials and so on. So rise in nationalism, rise in demagoguery, populist presidents who will be judged in the US. It will be in November. At the same time, and I know I need to finish up this question, we are seeing a debordering once again in the European Union. They are opening up the borders with a few exceptions, Northern Italy, for example, but they are reopening their borders inside the European Union for trade for trade and for the travel of people.
You have engaged with different borders and borderlands across the world. In case of South Asia, you have even traveled to some of the borderlands of South Asia. Plus, your book, Border Politics in Global Era, also talks about South Asian borderlands. So in that case, do you see any similarities between South Asian borderlands and the borderlands of your core competence, that is the US-Mexico borderlands? And do you feel that there can be some comparative study for the students and researchers from South Asia regarding the US-Mexico borderlands and the South Asian borderlands?
Okay, a good question. That's a two-part question, and I'll start with the first one. There are some similarities that come in the global study of borders. One of the key themes of the book, Border Politics in a Global Era, was to look at inequalities in pairs of landed borderlands. And in the US, North American situation, the US and Mexico have extremely unequal borders when measured with just about the only metrics that we have that I went into long explanations for in the book. Canada and the US are more similar. Now, between Canada and the US, when the North American Free Trade Agreement was started in 1994, Canada and the US became even more equal to one another as measured by economic metrics. The US and Mexico, however, over 25 years of the agreement, did not become more equal. Now we have a new trade agreement, US-Mexico, Canada agreement that started in 2020. So we shall see if that makes any difference. But I think in the context of comparative borderlands, India, of course, is in a very complicated situation because you have multiple borderlands with multiple countries, some of them unfriendly. And so security concerns rise to the surface even more than here in the US-Mexico borderlands. But inequalities and how to grapple with them, how to reduce them, what kinds of policy measures to take to reduce inequalities. Because once inequalities are reduced between countries, there are all kinds of consequences, including the motivation to migrate, concerns about security, and so on. I think a second issue that joins us in global and comparative border studies is that of the kinds of border guards. In the US, we call them the Border Patrol, federal agents who are policing the borderlands and do so, at least in the United States, without great concern for the human rights and respect and dignity of people who are crossing borders, whether they are asylum seekers, refugees, or economic migrants. Now, I say this knowing that in the last few days, India and China have been in a difficult situation with the tragic deaths of border security guards from India. But I'm looking at the broader pictures of the migrants who come from poorer countries and try to enter either temporarily or permanently into the richer countries in this economic context that I'm talking about. And I remember when I was doing the research on India, being somewhat surprised at the number of deaths of migrants seemingly at the hands of border guards. And this also occurs in the United States. And so here in the United States, after the deaths of way too many African Americans at the hands of internal police departments, we have 18,000 of them, many people are concerned and worried about the so-called warrior cultures, the militaristic cultures that seem to infuse law enforcement. And I think we can look at this not only locally with police departments in the US, but also at our border patrol or border guards. They have different names in different parts of the world. So I think that there are those similar issues that we can look at that we can take into account recognizing differences. India being much more complex in terms of many ethnic groups and languages and so on. The U.S. less so. The important concern in border studies, of course, is to try to look at and analyze and study the world from the borderlands perspective, a perspective in which the capital cities of countries often make and control policies in a way that doesn't take into account the interests or the voices of people who live in borderlands. So I think we also share the commonality in border studies of a lack of local governance institutions that join the voices and the interests of people who live in the borderlands. Of course, the big exception is the European Union with the superstructure that they have, which is a model that some people think is a useful one. Other people are quite critical of it because it undermines the nationalist spirit in countries. Let me now move to the second part of the question that you asked, and that is, what would be the scope for some comparative studies? I think always trade relationships are important, and we need to look at trade not only as formal trade, done by big business, done in a global spirit, but also informal trade. There are many people who make livelihoods for themselves and their families through informal economic activity, which could be defined as work and income generated activities outside of official regulations. I wrote a book in the late 1990s, 1998, called Free Trade, ? After free trade, informal economies at the USMexico border. And using all kinds of research methods, documented how important informal work was for sustaining families on both sides of the border, especially in Mexico. And so free trade, and I called them the quintessential free traders at a time period when the narrative was about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which mainly focused on formal businesses. So I would love to see studies of trade, especially focusing not on always illicit trade that damages people, drug trade, slavery, etc., but income generating activities that do not hurt people, but that help to generate livelihoods for people. In fact, when I was in India, I was intrigued by the HAATs. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, H-A-A-T.
HAATs, border HAATs.
The open air markets. My book on free trade in 1998 focused a lot on open air markets, people who worked on the streets in order to buy and sell to generate income for themselves and their families. And when I read more about the border HAATs, I was struck by the extremely burdensome regulations that were imposed upon them, the number of days per week, all kinds of regulations that seemed to give the bureaucrats a lot of work and generated income for them, I suppose, but probably stifled informal trade in border HAATs. If I were younger, I would love to be part of a research team based in India looking at the border HAATs, and I would enjoy being on any dissertation or master's degree committee working with people who were studying those things. I think that besides trade, another key area would be that of the meaning of citizenship, the meaning of documents associated with citizenship in the U.S. Context. Documents are so important and so challenging for people to obtain, and there's always the potential to render some people stateless in this situation, especially if they're fleeing from countries where they are in danger, where they are extremely impoverished, and so on. So statelessness the importance of documents, these are important research issues that we could focus on. Okay, I could say more, but I will stop in the interest of time.
Okay, so at this point, I would like to inform our viewers that we are mentioning the link to the book that Professor Kathleen was just talking about, her book Border Politics in Global Era. We are mentioning a description. We are mentioning a link to that book in the description box. All of you are requested to go and check out that book. And if you have any doubts, if you have any questions, you can mention in the comment sections, or you can also send them to us into our email ID, which we'll definitely try to communicate to Professor Kathleen. Okay, so Professor Kathleen, you have also looked at borders from the feminist perspective. So would you like to share some of the nuances of a feminist approach to borders? I mean, how is it, or how can it be different from the other approaches of borders or border studies?
Okay, thank you. In the most basic sense, the feminist perspective would insist that the experiences of women and men, men and women are fundamental to analyzing the comprehensive situation of a society. There have been so many studies in the past, even scientific studies in biology and health, that have excluded women from samples. And this is something that I think any good researcher, any scientific researcher simply cannot tolerate. We have to include the experiences of men and women. And when it comes to borderlands, the experiences of men and women are often quite different. For example, the journey, the migration journey and the crossing experience do have different implications for people's safety and health, depending on if they are male or female. For example, in the context of the US-Mexico border, it was once the case that mostly men migrants came to the United States searching for jobs, and later would try to find resources in order to bring wives and family members to the country. And more in these times, men and women both are joining the migrant journey. The women may be bringing children with them, which creates complications for the migration journey. So migration, that is one area where we need to understand the differences of both. Also the reasons for why people migrate. Sometimes, not sometimes, in studies that have been done about motivations to migrate, not only does impoverishment motivate people to migrate, but women sometimes experience domestic violence, family violence, attempted murder in countries where the police really don't take that kind of violence seriously. So one must understand these motivations for departure. Rarely do we, although societies that people migrate from might be dangerous, husbands are not leaving because they have been threatened and beaten by their wives. Domestic violence in the United States was once considered a principle for granting asylum to refugees and asylum seekers, but under this current Trump presidential administration, that principle no longer operates. A second reason for understanding differences between men and women would be the sort of violence that they experience. Just a minute. Oh, pardon me. The violence that people experience in borderlands may be different. In the US-Mexico borderlands, which seem to be a magnet for violence for a variety of reasons. The drug trafficking that happens, drug shippers are shipping to US consumers and use violent means. The different legal systems on both sides of the border But the upshot of all that is that we have gone through periods at the US-Mexico border where a problem emerged, a horrible problem that was named femicide or feminicidio in Spanish. And that was where women were kidnapped, violated, raped, often left in the desert. This happened in such volume and to such an extent that even international organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch began getting involved. And local police departments did very little to prioritize this problem. One of my books from 2008, Violence and Activism at the Border, focuses on femicide and also on domestic violence. And but in the book, I also focused on the sort of agency that women exercised in non-government organizations and in their activism and protest, because it's important that we not only view women as victims, but also as agents in trying to change their lives. Another issue that relates to a feminist approach, and I must insert a little footnote here that there are multiple forms of feminisms, socialist feminism, liberal feminism, global feminism, et cetera, et cetera. But another really basic concern in taking a feminist approach is this organizational culture that exists in law enforcement, in police departments, in border patrols, and so on, this warrior culture. And a feminist approach might look at the sort of masculinist, which is an awkward word to use, but it's sort of I could call this the social construction of hyper masculinity that seems to infuse some of these law enforcement agencies, whether they're at the border or in local police departments. I'm not sure what the statistics show about the number of women who are in the border guards in the United States. It's about 5% women who participate as employees in the Border Patrol. And I'm certainly not saying that the presence of women would create a different kind of organizational culture. What I am saying is that a tiny number of women who enter an organizational culture that is socially constructed as one based on force and aggression and cruelty and so on, the hyper-masculine approach is one that will affect everyone, men and women in the agency. And then finally, I could say that it's important that we study non-government organizations. Here at the central US-Mexico border, many of the human rights organizations, many of the immigration rights organizations, and other groups of that type are led by and or participated in by many women in a balanced way, leadership and participation in these groups. And I think that the more we learn about non-government organizations at the border and who participates in them and why, the better we will be able to see how the voices of border people might better inform what goes on. Now, of course, I realize that in hostile borderlands and alienated borderlands, such as between India and Pakistan, one might find an absence of non-government organizations. But at the US-Mexico borderlands, there are many non-government organizations, the so-called NGOs, that generate participation from people on both sides of the border. And even though not everyone has access to social media, the spread of social media technology has enabled people to communicate with one another and to do so without having to wait in the long lines that in the pre-pandemic area were typical of getting from one side of the border to the other. So that I could say more, but that would be my response to that question.
Yeah, so now if we talk about the US-Mexico border, which of course is your area of core competence, and you being located in the United States. So we have seen that on the after the current political dispensation in the United States that has come to power, we we kind of see a enthusiasm, if I can put it in that way, regarding this border wall that is coming up. So what do you think? What are your views? Can we call it an enthusiasm, or do you feel that it's, what is your take, or what are your views about this?
I would question the use of enthusiasm about the border wall. Certainly there's very little enthusiasm for the people who live along the borderline dividing the US and Mexico. Again, it's a 2,000-mile borderline. There are about 14 cities and towns that are closely connected to one another. The economies are very interdependent. Here in El Paso, we depend, at least in the pre-pandemic era, on many shoppers coming from Mexico, not only to smaller shops right near the downtown and near the borderline, but also to some of the larger malls. The interdependency also occurs with the factories, the maquiladoras that I talked about before, that produce goods that are trucked across the US-Mexico border to all 50 states. Well, not to Hawaii, but because of this interdependent and the manufacturing supply chain operation that occurs. So there is very little enthusiasm for the wall among people on both sides of the border. In fact, there have been surveys done of sizable numbers of people, not gigantic samples, but enough people to show that that there are a lot of similarities between people on both sides of the border, not in income, but similarities in how they view the other side of the border. Neighbors, interdependent, and total non-enthusiasm for the border wall. I think that the border wall, and I realize that, in the last 20 or 30 years, a variety of countries have begun building walls that are symbols of separation, of difference, symbols even of hate. And they are often installed by capital city politicians at the center who don't take into account the voices of border people. And so when it comes to research, I think that, and by the way, I should also say that once the November election occurs in the United States, the probability that Trump would not be reelected, I think that we will see an end to the funding and the building of more border wall. We already have about 800 miles of wall and high fencing at the US-Mexico border out of a 2,000-mile borderline. And right now, what is as Trump and his people, who represent perhaps a third of the population, when it comes to public opinion polls and support for this approach, they are building walls through people's property. This is occurring extensively in South Texas, in a state that normally respects and even glorifies property rights. But the federal government is taking control, dividing some of the people's ranch and agricultural farmland property. The wall builders are damaging ecosystems and the movement of water and animals back and forth across the border in ways that are central to the natural environment. There's been flooding, for example, in Nogales, Arizona, and the Nogales, which is named the same thing on the Mexico state side, in Sonora, because of these structures. The walls will be producing more problems than solving problems. They're very costly to build. And I think for research purposes, what probably will be stimulating more people, whatever political party of the two parties in the United States they belong to, is a cost-benefit analysis. It's sort of the basic tool that economists use to see whether or not the extremely high cost of building walls and maintaining them would be worth the benefit in the future of the interdependence that is more and more common in the whole North American scene, Canada, the US, and Mexico, with the new trade agreement that we have now. And furthermore, with the population, with the demographic growth or non-growth in the United States, I do think that the day will come, not now, but in the future, when the US needs to stimulate more migrants to come to the United States, whether temporarily or on a more permanent basis. The walls, in my mind, are symbols of hate, symbols of othering. More lately, Trump has been insisting that the walls be painted black. They are aesthetically an ugly reminder of hate that emanates from some politicians in the center of this country. Some people have even alleged that the walls being painted black will absorb heat, which in the southwest region of the United States, the desert region, where there's high heat, more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit during many summer months, that the color will actually absorb more heat, burn people as they try to cross the wall, try to get over the wall. People do manage to get across the wall. For those who, and I do recognize the need for some control of the borderlines, but there are other ways to do it. And those ways have been used before: the use of technology, the use of heat sensors, and so on, which, if done in a humane way and done with immigration reform and return to the historic practices of US asylum policy, I think that this would be a far better way to manage the borderline between the US and Mexico than the ugly walls that take people's property, that cost a lot of money, and that symbolize hate in this region.
Yeah.
So that is the response.
So that is it. We have almost reached the end of this wonderful and interesting interaction. We thank you so much, Professor Kathleen, for joining us for this interaction amidst your busy schedule. We wish you a very good health, and we look forward to more and more of your stimulating and interesting work regarding borders and border studies. Thank you so much, Professor Kathleen.
Thank you for the good questions. Bye-bye.